Well, thank you all for joining us. We'll hopefully have a few more joining us a little bit later, but we'll get started. So welcome all to our online practical webinar series on carbon farming methods. And I would just like to acknowledge that this is delivered with funding support from the Commonwealth of Australia through the Department of Climate Change, Energy and the Environment and Water, under the Carbon Farming Outreach Program in collaboration with the Grower Group Alliance. And we've got our guest speaker today, James Henderson from Isidore, and our RM Regional Manager, Elle Rands. And over to you, Elle, just to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Mo. Hi, everyone. I'm Elle Rands, the Regional Manager for Southern Inland Queensland. So I'm based in Goondiwindi. We also have an office in Roma. But yeah, I'm just here giving Mo and James a hand, facilitating some of the chat and letting people in. Thanks.
And James, over to you.
Yeah, good day, everyone. So James Henderson for Isidore Ag. I'm a beef producer by trade, and we also have, with some other farmers, a consultancy company where we basically give advice on carbon farming and other environmental offsets, wind farms, EPBC stuff, and all that sort of thing, and have been involved with AgForce, various roles for the last nearly 10 years, I think. So, yeah, glad to be presenting this. Thanks, mate.
Thank you. So pretty much James is going to do a presentation on current available projects and then what might be coming into the future. So over to you, James.
Right, thanks, Mo. Yeah, well, thanks everyone for jumping on to this presentation. I appreciate that this will probably cover a lot of topics because it's pretty broad sort of a scope. So normally, ideally, this would take about 3 hours, but we're going to try and get through a lot of information in about an hour. So if we're going along at any point and you have a question, just put your hand up. So a little icon that says raise hand, or you can put your questions in the chat, and Mo or Elle will pick up on that and let me know. Also, if there's any raised hands. So because it's such a big presentation, rather than wait for questions at the end, we'll try and address them as we go. So yeah, once again, yeah, James Henderson, Isidore Ag and Eco Solutions, founded by farmers for farmers, and we're going to be rattling through these potential project methods that are available to producers as of now. So that list is actually quite short because if many of you are watching this space, there's been quite a few methods that have dropped off due to basic legislative requirements because they go through their 10-year period. So the first one we're going to talk about is savanna burning projects. So, you know, this is probably a pretty common method, particularly in Northern Australia. It's certainly one that gets a lot of headlines for a number of different reasons, but we'll just go to the next slide, please, Mo, and we'll go through its eligibilities. Yeah, so basic overview of it. Look, it's basically changing how you manage fire on your property, right? So it's a simple concept that you used to have a lot of late season hot fires, and you're going to swap to a lot more cool, early season cool fires, and basically you get paid for the difference. There's a lot of positives about savanna burning in that ultimately it doesn't compete with your agricultural enterprise; it aligns with it. So you tend to have, you know, a lot more, as opposed to planting trees or doing blue carbon, where you simply exclude area for production. It generally fits well with ag, where it can be applied. It can be applied to large areas, and it has this little thing because it's ultimately you're getting paid to stop the emissions going into the atmosphere in the first place, which is a different concept to a lot of other methods which draw down emissions. It's seen as a high integrity method, and its other big advantage that you can combine with First Nations and your local Indigenous groups attracts a pretty hefty price premium. You know, so it can be up to up to double what a traditional ACCU off the shelf, like what they call generic ACCU or 1 tonne of carbon is worth. So look, the problems with it, the ACCU, so the ACCU is obviously Australian Carbon Credit Unit. It's the 1 tonne of sequestered carbon. I would have covered that in the earlier workshops. The ACCU yields are not guaranteed because it depends on your management. The return to asset is typically lower. It's just because the properties tend to be larger and the areas are smaller that's affected. So from a bank's risk point of view, it can be a bit harder to talk to your bank about. Whereas some of the other methods, the risk ratio is flipped around. And the big risk with savanna burning, obviously, is if you get late wet seasons, which inhibit that ability to have early season fires. Next slide, please, Mo. So this is the practicalities of what it looks like. So you can see on the graph there, the blue bars on the left of screen, that's your historical fire data. So basically the emissions from those historical data. They get a lot of this information off a website called NAFI, Northern Australia Fire Index. It's a publicly available website. Anyone can access it. It's actually pretty easy to use. And you can jump on that website yourself and have a look at your historical burns and things like that. And essentially what that does is you get those historical 10 years and you get the average. The average of those previous 10 years is the red line. And then you go, righto, so we're still going to have those big late season fires, which are those really hot ones, which are, up the top there. And we're going to start doing some cool burns. So the orange bar is your new emissions from your new fires, where you're burning earlier in the season. And you get paid for the difference. So your ACCU generation is the green bars. So in a lot of ways, it's a pretty simple method. You're just getting paid to have less hot fires. So it can work in the favour of a lot of people. Next slide, please, Mo. The basic eligibility requirements of this stuff, and once again, a lot of this stuff was probably touched in the earlier webinars, but the key principle of additionality, it can't be business as usual. So a lot of the times there's a lot of people in some of those fire areas that are in Northern Australia that have already moved to those cool season burns. So that it needs to be additionality, so it can't be business as usual. So if you're already doing a heap of cool burns, you can't turn around and say, oh, but I was doing late season fires 5-10 years ago. You've got to start doing it as of when you start the project. The location, look, it's got to be, you've got to have 600 mil rainfall plus, and you've got to be in those fire prone savanna areas of Northern Australia. You're not going to do this on the Darling Downs or in the southeast corner. And obviously your management practice changes. You're going to have cooler fires, and basic principles around record keeping. Obviously keep areas you burnt, the areas like how much fuel you used, what the graders, how many hours the grader did, how much fuel you used, etc., etc. Basic principles of land tenure and permanence apply. The permanence on this one's a little bit different. It's not a 25-year project. They tend to be short ones, like 5-7 years, and they are a bit flexible in that compared to a lot of other projects that they're a bit more bespoke. And once again, the Indigenous involvement that really unlocks the door to some pretty good price premiums, so it's nothing to be sneezed at to have double the price of your ACCU. In some cases, not all, but in some cases getting up there, which is it's a pretty good thing to have. Next slide, please, mate. Basic yields, like people often first question everyone asks, how much money can I make? Well, you can make roughly 0.5 to 3 ACCUs per hectare per year. So remember, an ACCU is 1 tonne of carbon, so that's 1 tonne of avoided carbon. So anywhere between 0.5 tonne and 3 tonnes of avoided emissions going into the atmosphere is what you essentially make per hectare per year. Now, it's obviously got to be those areas where there are fires. Like if you don't burn every year, it's going to be hard, and you might burn every 3rd year, every 5th year. Well, it's probably going to be hard to prove that you are in a fire-prone area. If you go above the baseline, so you actually have an accidental hot fire, essentially if the project gets paused, like there's a lot of these methods allow for mistakes and acts of nature. They're not that inhibitive that they try and claw back credits quickly. So there is assurances within the method that the project is paused, and we just wait till we get back on track, then it kicks into gear again. So you're more likely just to see no ACCUs issued for a year or two until you catch up and get back to where you need to be. And obviously the things that are pretty common with all carbon projects these days, and there'll be a theme across today, is stacking things like accounting for nature, so other environmental accounts on top of your carbon project. If you've got people going into the field, it doesn't take much extra to record a little bit more information, and then you're in a much better position for things like price premiums, other potential markets that may arise, like things like accounting for nature is going to probably morph into the nature repair market and things like this. So it's something to be very aware of. What else can you do while you're going? Next slide, please, Mo. Do we have any questions on Savannah before we keep going into soil? Nope. I don't. Right, so this is probably the big one that most people talk about. This is probably where the carbon industry is really at the moment, which is soil carbon projects. That's a soil core rig in Dalby. So probably fun fact, most people have seen the Christie post driver. So the one that drives the Steely's little Honda on the Christie implement that you drive for steel posts. It was actually originally designed for driving soil cores. So that's a little fun fact for everyone. Next slide, please, Mo. So soil, once again, you've got to basically prove that you're changing what you're doing. So you want to change your on-farm management to increase the amount of soil carbon stored in your soil. So it's once again, you can't get paid for what's there. You've got to increase. So that concept of additionality comes in from the start. The good thing about soil carbon projects is a bit like Savannah burning. You're not moving away from agriculture too much. Ultimately, you're still staying in that realm of ag, where you essentially are getting paid to increase your production, because the more soil carbon in your soils, the greater its water holding capacity. So it's everyone should be trying to do this anyway. It's just whether you want to ramp it up to the stage of actually trying to do a soil carbon project. It's typically simpler to apply for large areas, and obviously the underlying pursuit stays the same. So if you can get that kick out of production as well as the credits, it's where it sort of becomes quite profitable. Some of the cons with it is the ACCUs are not guaranteed, because it's a measured, not modeled approach. So what that means is you'll measure your baseline, it's X, and then you'll measure in 5 years' time, that's X plus 1, so you get paid the plus 1. So you can't really model that. It's really dependent on your dedication and your management actions as an individual, as a farmer, is how far you really ramp that up. The practice changes usually are a pretty significant cost for the business on the lifetime of the project. So for most people, that means poly posts and wire. That's generally what it comes down to. And the good thing about the measured method results in your sampling costs. So it's not uncommon to hear stories of $100,000 to baseline and things like this, but it does come down to a per hectare rate. If you go with different carbon providers, will have different rates where they take different percentages, but ultimately you can usually work it back to what is the sample cost per hectare, and that'll give you a pretty fair indication who's the cheapest and who's not. The more samples per hectare, the more integrity, the better the data. We can go less samples per hectare. It's cheaper, but the data is not as doesn't have the integrity. Next one, please, Mo. So, these are the eligibility requirements. These is the management actions that really drive the change, and the Clean Energy Regulator is very specific about these. And that's them there, applying nutrients, whether that's gypsum or lime, not big in Queensland, but very prevalent in the southern states. Pasture improvements include establishing new pastures. So sort of a common one people look at is converting old cultivation into lacuna and things like that. Establishing new irrigation or irrigating new legumes or cover crops. Once again, it's a bit southern centric. It's not all that prevalent up here. Converting to no-till or stubble retention. Well, I think most people got out of the recreational tillage game in Queensland and started direct tilling in the early 2000s. So it's not common to see that one used. Altering the stocking rate, duration, or grazing intensity, that is the number one thing. So 99% of soil carbon projects, that's the action they use. It's all about cows and intensity. So I think cell grazing, rotational grazing, holistic management, however you want to call it, that's the key piece here. There is some modification of landscape and landform features. That's a bit of sort of natural sequence farming, like pondage banks and those sorts of things. The problem with that is it doesn't sort of line up across an entire, well, it's hard to line it off across an entire farm. Soil carbon projects generally take in the whole property. So it's very hard to go do a small project in one corner of your property because you still count all the emissions associated with that property. So it's hard to do like an intense, so we're going to do some lacuna over here but then we've got all this other grazing land that's staying the same. So it's a bit of a tricky one, that one. And that's why the altering stocking rate and duration and grazing intensity tends to be the one that triggers the actual management practice change. Next slide, please, Mo. So these are just a couple of screenshots from our AgriWeb from my properties. I did this yesterday just to give a bit of context. So we come across, we get a lot of questions about soil carbon, and typically they fall into the column on the left. So that's our breeder block there. And our breeder block, it's about 4,600 hectares. It's made up of essentially 10 large paddocks, 10 small paddocks. Now, we do rotate cattle, but probably not quite enough at the current intensity to really sort of generate much, genuine change in the soil carbon to the point we recover our costs or baselining. So you look at that and you think, oh, well, there is, if I cut up some of those bigger breeder paddocks, and those smaller paddocks is where we developed. It's a different soil type over there. So the top left-hand corner, it's a heavier red clay. That's where we develop. That's where we put, Rhodes grass and legumes and desmanthus and things like that. So you could nearly say, well, if I developed them up and did a heap of those ones, like I'd probably get a pretty significant change. But if I didn't coincide with cutting up the rest of the breeder paddocks and increasing the breeder's main rotation in the larger paddocks, the project probably wouldn't stack up financially. And that's where most producers fall into that left-hand column. They're managing their property pretty well. They don't have cows in every paddock, and they sort of don't have a lot of additionality, a lot of room to move. The right-hand one, this is our backgrounding property down towards Geelong. And it used to be 5 paddocks. I think it's now 9. Yeah, 9. And we should have done a soil carbon project here, but we started moving cattle down there probably 15 years ago. It's a good example of where you should do it. So you've got a simple system where you've got just dry cattle. You haven't got breeders. It is easy to kick off the ground and to maintain. Both these properties have good clay. They both have plus 600 mil, so they've got good potential to basically pull it all together. But once again, with the right-hand one, most producers we talk to have sort of always already down that path. So if you're thinking to yourself, is soil carbon suitable to me? Well, think, if I've got, count up the number of paddocks you've got and say, in the next 10 years, can I double it? Have I got 600 mils of rain? Have I got clay? And can I double the number of paddocks I have in the next 10 years? If you got yes to all those questions, well, then you've probably got pretty good potential to have a look at a soil carbon project. Next one, please, Mo. So the ACU production, as we said, like it's basically a direct measurement system one. So basically the things that drive it obviously are the soil carbon in the soil. It's the bulk density. So how, as you go deeper into soil, so you're putting soil cores that go down about 1 metre. And as you get deeper, the bulk density increases because it gets more compacted. And then you obviously convert it back to actual, CO2e. The factor there is 3.67, which is the same for vegetation. That's how you convert soil organic matter back to CO2e. In those paddocks, when you do, start a project, there's a fair bit of mapping involved to break. So you've got all your managed paddocks, and then within those paddocks, you'll have slightly different soil types. So you break that up into strata, and then you get randomized sample points within that. The typical yields, which is pretty commonly reported, is sort of 1.4 tonnes to 5.5. That's basically pretty common for what's been reported. Some people are getting more than that, but whether they can maintain it, I don't know. And there are some people getting less than that. Like there are examples of people getting 0, and there's examples of people getting 6. So this is a pretty simple example of how this sort of looks in real life. So on the left-hand side of the graph there, you have, essentially your baseline period. So that's where you essentially taken your stocking history, what cows have I had, what fuel have I used, et cetera, et cetera. And at year 0 there, your baseline. You start cutting up your paddocks, and then you measure your soil carbon using the sampling techniques, so using the soil cores, and you get paid for that increase on your baseline. So that's the first red arrow. Then essentially what will happen is you'll continue those practices. You might get a drought, it might drop, but if you continue those practices, you should theoretically keep going up. And then you'll get paid from the top of the first arrow to the bottom of the second if there's an increase. That's the increase you're chasing, and so on and so forth. If you fall below the any of one of those tops of those red arrows, you don't have to pay back your ACCUs. It's a bit like other projects where your project is simply paused, and then there's a time frame wait until you basically get back on track again. So it is designed to work with agriculture pretty well. Next one, please, Mo. And look, what does that translates to, pretty good tonnes per hectare for the 25 years, 40 to 150 tonnes per hectare over the life of the project. ACCUs are trading at soil carbon ACCUs are trading at a bit of a premium to some of the other, traditional generics or HIR and gas field ones at the moment. And obviously, you really need the 600 mils plus the clay, because I think if anyone remembers back to the first online session with Richard Eckard's description of the carbon cycle, you want that the clay stops the leaching, and it keeps a bit more soil carbon in your system. So if you're not losing any to leaching and it stays in the clay, that's where it gets pretty good. That's about him. I think, is there any questions on soil carbon, please?
So James, Ramo's just got a comment in the chat. He's got his hand up.
Yeah, Ramo, yeah, mate.
You're on mute, Ramo.
How's that?
Much better.
Yep, got you, mate.
Yeah, g'day, James. Great presentation, and couldn't be truer what you said in that there. My comment is that some 3 years ago, the Commonwealth Government gave $50 million to a number of carbon service providers and companies to go out and reduce the sampling cost, or to get it down to $3 a hectare. That was a target at that point in time. Plenty of them have come back now, and we can see there's a lot of carbon service providers out there flying the flag and doing these sort of things and saying, come and look at us, we can do this, we can do that. And that's where all our money went. And there's no concrete and scientifics behind any of their evidence yet, in the respect that it has reduced our cost to $3, or nor is available to us at that cost. I made the comment that the $50 million would have been better spent on going and giving them, going and buying whether $50 million worth of soil sampling rigs, and going and upgrading, increasing the lab capacity so that they can take those soil samples to the lab down the likes of down at, what's his name, Graham, down in Lismore, New South Wales, USQ, is it?
Oh,
Whatever, the soil lab is down there. That's where I get my soil samples done. And so that they can handle that capacity, and we would have had high integrity results that are true and that are correct and that are good reference points, so that other people can go away and have a look at it and go, I think I'll do a soil carbon project, or no, I won't do a soil carbon project. And we also would have had some more free tools available, like when you look at Look-See on the website, and we would have had Look-See upgraded and have a better representation of carbon projects. So when you go in and you map out your place, because they're back to 30 by 30 squares, we could get down to less if we spent more money on that.
Yeah, mate, 100%. I would agree with you on that. Yeah, the government's pretty good, I think, at putting money in the wrong spot. So,
I can show you I can show you who they gave it to. I can name them. It's public knowledge. It's public knowledge, by the way.
Yeah. I know where it went, mate. Yeah, and I know the companies, and I probably would point out that you can do it fee for service. You can do it independent of the carbon companies if you wish. If you're worried about that side of integrity and that, and so there's a number of fee for service soil companies out there that do this stuff now. Which gives you a bit more integrity.
So what happened? I'll share my story here, and I'll share it publicly now. Ramo, I think we just need to keep moving on. Otherwise, we'll hijack this whole presentation. And if we can wait to the end, and then we can have another discussion there, if that's okay.
No problems, Bob. Too easy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, James, for that presentation. Fantastic.
No worries, mate. Right, we'll keep. Is there any other questions on soil carbon before we go again?
Amy just made a comment to say National Soil Action Plan addresses improved soil monitoring at a national scale. If you'd like to look into it, they're testing chemistry, biology, and physics. So,
yeah,
there's not really a question.
Plenty plenty happening in that space. So here's the other one, environmental planning projects. So this is getting quite popular at the moment. So we'll rattle through this one, although it tends not to apply to most broad-scale agricultural operations in Queensland. But we'll rattle through this one pretty quick, please, mate. So next slide, mate. And yeah, this one's pretty easy, a bit like the others. The clues in the name, so it's pretty simple. It's planting native species into non-forest ground. So somewhere it doesn't grow trees, you're going to go plant trees. There are some pros with it. It does yield particularly high levels of carbon. It's pretty cheap to sort of model, because it's not a measurement-based one like soil carbon. So it can be quite cheap to run the associated running costs of the actual project. And it is very much perceived as a high integrity market. So ACCUs are selling for pretty good premiums at the moment. And once again, it really does lend itself to dropping accounting for nature programs and those sorts of things. So yeah, it's a pretty good sort of a system for dropping other programs like accounting for nature on top of it and trying to get a better price. Some of the cons with it, it is a bit like soil carbon. It's at that high initial cost, of anything from $1,500 to $10,000 a hectare, driven by site specifics. So if you go into environmental plannings, pick an area where their seeds are cheap. So don't go replanting. Well, you can if you want, but if you want to go replant, for argument's, vine scrub that has 300 species per hectare, you're going to have a bit of trouble. But if you go replant, say a blue gum or a red gum flat, that's pretty close to a monoculture. There's only a few things in there. The seeds are really readily available. They're very vigorous, high chance of success. So you've got to be a little bit strategic about what you plant and where. There is there's a large change in the agricultural use, getting away from ag. In the later stages, you can put the cattle back in once the vegetation is up and going. And obviously, it is a little bit prone for some natural disaster risk because it's all sort of very concentrated, unlike a regenerating natural system that has a lot more resilience. Next one, please, Mo. So baseline forest. So yeah, basic eligibility requirements for this is the planting cannot be forest. So, and you can't essentially go clear forest to plant forest. So because all carbon projects have a baseline period where they look, retrospectively back at what was there beforehand, you can't go say, oh, well, 3 years ago it was a forest, then you've cleared it, and now you want to plant it. There are very much restrictions around that. The little bit of a pain with the plantings one is the newness clause in it. So prior to registration, like no site activities can be commenced. So preparation and seedling procurement. So I think they're getting a bit more flexible with those sorts of things now. And there has been more talks of changing that method, because if you want to do this at scale, think about if you're planting Lacana or if you're doing large scale crop preparation, you just don't go, right, today we're going to start and we're going to finish next week. They are extended planting periods. You want to make sure you can actually achieve forest cover, which is generally not too hard. It's only 2 meters and 20% canopy. And obviously, it's permanence. Once again, that's that old 25 or 100 year period. You just got to be a little bit careful. Like some of them do tend to get held up in local councils. So the LGAs can sometimes be a bit funny about environmental plantings. And once again, look, if you got more than 600 mils, you're going to be on a bit of a winner. You can do and you can do mallee plantings in low rainfall regions, which is not particularly common in Queensland. I think it's more in sort of Western Australia. But currently, the best places for EP in Queensland is in north, like up in the tropics, and down the southeast corner. It's because you can stack those other environmental credentials like accounting for nature. You can provide koala habitat up north, looking at tree kangaroo habitat and a few other bits and pieces. So they're the two hotspots in Queensland for environmental plantings at the moment. And yeah, that's probably changing slowly as the price of the credit goes up. So this is a typical ACU production curve from EP. So what you see is and this, everyone knows most trees, particularly eucalypts, that's how they grow. They're pretty fast out of the blocks, and essentially they slow down. So the good thing about this is it can be pretty accurately modelled. So at the start of the project that how many tonnes per hectare you're going to be earning at year 5, year 6, year 10, and you can plan it out and you can get plan it with your banks and everything else. So it's pretty good for getting return on investment quickly, which is one of the reasons it's popular in some of those in those areas where it's being used. Next one, please, Mo. So typically you're getting over the life of the project at 100 to 800 tonnes per hectare. It's pretty high tonnes per hectare. A lot of people try to be careful about what trees they plant. Strike that balance between yield, opportunity, risk. So don't just plant the cheapest one and get the quickest dopamine hit. Just remember you have got obligations in these areas. I think at the end of the day, you do have to use what is local. So if you've got an alluvial flat, you can't go plant spotted gum on it, for argument's sake, because you think you might harvest a spotted gum at the end, even though it probably would grow there. If it's an alluvial flat, you've got to go get alluvial species at whatever part of Queensland you are. Disturbance events is a bit the same as the other ones. If you don't hit your baseline, typically the area is paused until you can reevaluate and kick on and go again. So generally no paying back of credits. A little interesting thing called belt plantings. There's a little sort of I call it a bit of it's a glitch in the matrix, if you will. So if you do, but it's all based on science. But if you do belt plantings as opposed to block plantings, so you have these 40-meter wide belts, you get that bit of extra growth on the side. And essentially what it means under the model is you get a bit of a sugar hit, and you tend to get a bit better yield of tons per hectare. And it also means you get that bit more grass between your belts. So that's sort of a good little underutilized part of the environmental plantings, where people think, oh, I might want to plant a little bit. Well, you can plant a little bit by using belts and get a bit of best of both worlds in that one. Let's see, Mo. Any questions on EP, please? Oh. Right. Well, we'll go into it's the grey area at the moment. So as many people would know, if you're on this, there used to be two vegetation myths in Australia called human-induced regeneration and avoided clearing. Now, they both reached their sunset period, i.e. they ran for 10 years. And then under the Carbon Farming Act, they must be retired after 10 years. And basically, the new methods weren't ready to rock and roll. They weren't ready. Both these new methods that are available are in draft methodology at the moment. So integrated farm and land management method, and the avoided re-clearing of native forest. So these are essentially the replacements for the HIR and the AC methods, which is what is the most projects that are out there. When people talk carbon farming in Western Queensland in the Mulga, they're generally talking human-induced regeneration, i.e. HIR, and it was shut down a few years ago because it reached its sunset period. IFLM is ticked to replace it. Next slide, please, Mo. So it's once again, it's been, the old method was shut down and basically the new one wasn't ready to go. So they've got a replacement method called avoided re-clearing and native reforestation method. It's still in draft. The details are not finalised, but it's expected to be better. It's meant to be broader than the original avoided clearing, which was a bit of a difficult one to prove. It required 2 previous clearing events in cycle. The new method is only proposing 1 previous clearing event. It also takes, it used to be a hard and fast rule about if it was 20% canopy or under or over, so it was either in or out. So it's a bit more of if it's just under, so if it's 10 to 20 or 10 to 19, you can count it as a reforestation. So you can there's a bit more flexibility in the new proposed method, and hopefully that'll filter through. The cradling is getting away from the really front end heavy. So the original avoided clearing, you got essentially 80-something% up front. And then for the remaining 24 years, you got a trickle, a very slow, small cradling amount. They're trying to reverse that a bit and get a less lumpy feel and a more consistent crediting. So that's the idea. It's a better representation of what happens on ground. There are some things with the permanence periods. It's a bit up in the air because they want 100. The proposed method has things like 50-year permanencies. A mix of 25s, 50s, 70s, and 100s. The problem is the actual Act doesn't allow for those, so there's going to have to be a change to the Act before that goes through Parliament. So this, as a live method, you're probably not going to see any real opportunity for another, at least 9 months, I would guess. And then after that, these projects still take a minimum 12 months, probably 18 months to set up. So, 2 years before you get paid, sort of thing. There's also the other concerns around the changes to the EPBC Act, which obviously influences that one as well. This is the next big one, which is the integrated farm land management method. It's been on the drawing cards for quite a long time. It's a very politically charged method. because there's a lot of people trying to, have influence on how it's put together and how it's not put together. Once again, it's in draft format at the moment, available for public consultation. And the simple concept around it is it's a bit like AC and AC 2.0, where you can have multiple carbon pools. So you can have some planting over here, you can have some soil carbon down here, and some natural regeneration in between. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, that one. I don't see it getting off the ground anytime soon, but I would love to be proven wrong. But there is believed to be within it a simple regeneration component. So where you've got sort of very small regrowth, like lignotubers, and if you start rotating your cattle through or your sheep or your goats through some sort of grazing system, and you allow those seedlings and those lignotubers to get up and start forming into a forest, I believe there is a bit of an opportunity with IFLM, so which is very similar to the old HIR, which was, like I say, a lot of those very common projects out west in the Mulga that probably people are more familiar with. Next one, please, Mo. Just quickly, is there any questions on any of that so far? On the proposed mess? It's all theoretical, I know, but I'll try and answer anything I can on those methods. Nope. Oh, yeah. Edward?
Yeah, hi there, James, and thank you for your time. Just wondering what your view is on why there's been such extensive sort of delays and to and forwards, with the government on finalising some of these methodologies.
It's probably pretty easy to be very cynical here and just say that there's too many vested interests trying to have those methods. Some want them very simple, so it's very easy to generate lots of carbon cheaply, and other interests want it very complicated, so it's very high integrity, so the price of carbon goes up. So I think those competing interests are the problem. I think at the end of the day, when you think that that started in 2017, and they're 9 years into it and they haven't delivered, sort of gives you the red flag. And I think they really forgot about agriculture along the way in developing that method. I think agriculture was put to the side, and essentially the carbon industry on its own, in its own little bubble, a bit like the Canberra bubble, went off and developed that method, and it's probably why it is the way it is my cynical view, but I'd love to be proven wrong.
Yeah, and do you have any sense that there's a sort of increased urgency actually to get legislation sort of signed and finalised, or is it just going to go round and round and round?
No, there is actually a big increase in urgency from Canberra, and it's to do with that safeguard mechanism, which I think might have been covered in the first workshop. So that's the safeguard mechanisms, legislation passed by the government in 2022, where they basically said to the big polluters, you need to buy credits. If you can't get your emissions down, you need to buy credits. So basically, they need these broad-scale vegetation methods like IFLM and avoided clearing. They need them up and running because you just can't plant enough trees. You can't do enough soil carbon projects. So unless they get carbon credit projects at scale, they're just not going to be able to meet those requirements under the safeguard mechanism. So that's essentially one of the reasons why I think they'll keep actually pushing along this one. Is my guess, yeah. We have other questions? I think we did, didn't we?
Yeah, thanks, Edward. Ramo?
Yeah, just to add to that there, the issue is with the IFLM method is the integrity, and that's what it's all about, because of the Chubb review and in the HIR. And they're trying to address all those issues that they had in HIR so it doesn't reoccur again, and then so that they can reintegrate it into, i.e. have a tree growing there and have soil have soil underneath it, have the tree generate carbon and have the soil generate carbon, in a nutshell, in the short.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah, and there's problems with stacking and does that meet IPCC standards and this and that, and they're using, I think, similar system for avoided clearing 2.0. So they're changing the mapping requirements, which ultimately makes the carbon projects more expensive, which puts the roadblock up again. So that's 100%. That's all those little technical details is what they're essentially working through. Everyone sort of agrees on the concept, but the delays ultimately means there's no option for producers who are wanting to engage.
The main point there is so we can maintain our high integrity, because Australian the ACCUs are high integrity compared to Vera, Gold, or any of the others. We are noted to be the leaders in it, and especially when it comes to soil carbon as far as integrity on that there. And they want to maintain that, and they don't want to have another chap and give carbon a bad name.
Yep, that's right. And it's a pretty good example. If you're doing carbon projects with ACCUs, you generally do them to sell them. If you want to do insetting and use carbon credits for yourself, you go to a low project value like a gold standard or a Vera project international models, where the value of the credit's pretty low. It's cheaper to generate. It's much better used for insetting.
But will it be tradable under the CER and under the Australian regulations? Will
not
it
under
be
the
there?
CER.
Yeah, that's
it won't
right.
be under the
So
CER, but you can. But you can retire at climate active.
Yeah. So, but if you want to, pardon me, if you want to inset it.
Yeah.
If you want to
inset, you can use Vera and Gold Standard at climate active, which is what Telstra does, which is what Santos does, Qantas does. They have a small Australian-based ACCU project for the glossy shareholder cover, and they go buy 80% of their credits from South American wind farm for $1 or less, and that makes up their balance of their sheet. So as in ag, we can use the same system that the big corporates can use. It is actually set up that way, but unless you're vertically integrated, I think you talked about this the other day, Ron, there's no price point. It's kind of why do you want to do it? It's almost it's only if you want to do it. There's no sort of commercial viability around a lot of this stuff. So
yeah, but that could be fixed with the legislation change and says, that's great, guys, you're buying all these non-audited or low audited things. We want to you operate here in Australia, you need to buy Australian carbon credit units, and they're available here. You need to buy them to support Australian made and Australian bought, and lift our economy up and keep us going, like Trump is doing what he's doing over there. And those credits are now no longer usable then if they have a legislation change.
Oh yeah, in Australia, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But anyway, we'll keep cracking on just for the time frame. We've got 10 minutes to get through the last bit. It shouldn't take long. So look, this is just some key other points to wrap it all up. So if you're thinking about a project or you have a project, the number one thing when you engage with, because you'll most likely engage with a carbon company. Carbon companies are all a bit like banks, right? You just need to understand when you're talking to them and negotiating with them, that you are comparing apples with apples, because their structures are all so different. The fundamental rule you need when you're doing carbon projects, or if you have carbon projects, is you need to have access to your credits should you require them. So if you're undertaking a new project, it's pretty important that you get your solicitor to add that term in there. It probably won't be in there. Some of the carbon providers have that in their contracts, others don't. But it's a really sort of key concept to have access to those credits should you need them. Some people say you need to keep all the credits for yourself because you're going to need them. That's a personal choice, but they tend to be worth money, so most people sell them. And the most likely use of this would be to simply access your credits to simply access some sort of small market or a unique market, or avoid a price penalty for a specific market. Maybe in the banking and the finance sector, it might catch up. And as we just discussed with Rano, yes, and it was discussed earlier in the week, basically at the moment, there is no premiums for carbon neutral and also no premiums for low carbon. So no one can show me a grid yet where Jays or TBS have that column for premiums for carbon, but don't be surprised if it does turn up there one day. Next slide, please, Mo. So this is a possible example that could happen. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but this is much more likely than scenario than someone saying you need all your carbon to be carbon neutral. If you want to go down that path, you're more likely to do a carbon neutral product, not a business. So you'll make one particular line of your cattle carbon neutral, like just your steers. There's no point for your breeders to be carbon neutral, just your steers, because they're the ones that go to the premium market. Or if you're not doing that, it's more likely to be something like this. So a large processor that basically adds an emissions intensity on a high value grid, something like EU. It would make sense if it was the EU, because this is where a lot of this, the SBTI, this is where it's all coming from. And you have a GAF intensity, so you would have done the GAF tool yesterday, and yours might be, for argument's sake, 16 kilos of CO2e. And there'll be a premium will be at 13 kilos of CO2e. So for you as a producer, you go, well, I could spend an extra bloody $15,000-$20,000 on bulls. I could develop some country. I can a big long list of things you could do. Or the other option that might be available to you is to say, well, I only need X amount of credits. It probably won't be many to drop your emissions intensity by 2 kilos. So that's just a really simple example where you'll be able to get the return on those ACCUs, as opposed to trying to feed the entire system through your business and trying to make your entire business carbon neutral. But it's a really good example of why you need to understand the whole picture. So you need to know your GAF number, and you also need to have access to your credits. And if you start putting the whole thing together, it just gets you in that best possible position. And the other thing about that too is, I'll start on the slide shortly. The other thing is the banking sector and where they're moving to. So you could essentially have the same example with banks, right? Where they say your emissions intensity is X, your risk load, you're going to get 0.01 of a risk percentage point of a risk loading because your emissions intensity is 15, not 13. Because they are covered under the IFRS standard, which is the old TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Based Financial Disclosures. Next one, please. No. So as Ramo alluded to before, so the gateway check. So this was a really big deal in the carbon industry that came through in 2023, and what it resulted in these changes called gateway checks. They're essentially additional layer of reporting and auditing, and they're every 5 years, and you've got to go through them. A gateway check is, it's initiated by the regulator, not your carbon company, and essentially it's to make sure that what you say is there is there. Next one, please, Mo. And this is how it sort of works. Now, it's a bit of a complicated slide, but it's actually pretty simple. So when you would have done the initial stratification, they would have been looking for X amount of forest cover, just a little bit of forest cover, at a pretty high scale, at 1,000 to 200 hectare scale, so a pretty high resolution, zoomed out a fair way. And then there would have been and then at year 6, they're going to say, right, and these are the changes. Essentially, well, we're now going to zoom into 100 hectares, and at year 10, we're going to 10 hectares. And then once we get close to the end of the project, we're going down to 0.2 of a hectare. So what's happening? A lot of people, when they signed, so if you've got a carbon project, an old HIR project, you've done the initial stratification, and depending on where you are in your project, you might be year 8. So you mightn't have been around. So you're going to skip year 6. So what it means is people are going from initial, and a small group of producers going from initial straight to year 10 in their regeneration check. And this is the example where credits are having to be repaid. So this is pretty impressive. So if you have a human-induced regeneration project or a native forestry managed regrowth project, and it was signed in 2015, 16, 17, 18, somewhere in there, there's every chance that you haven't gone through the 6-year project and you're going to be dropped straight into the 10-year project. So Not everyone's going to have a problem, but there are certainly live examples of people having to pay back, lots of money. And it's not that producer's fault. It's basically because they weren't aware of the changes that went through. So whether the carbon company didn't apply it to them, didn't make them aware of it, or they just simply didn't know the Chubb review. This is what the essence of the Chubb review was. Next one, please, Mo. So look, yeah, basically, people say the carbon industry's sort of fallen off a cliff. It has to a lot of degrees, but it's still sort of kicking along. It's more about integrity now than ever before. So the market is very much demanding high integrity credits. So starting from you as a producer starts with your records and your ability to understand the whole landscape, from your GAF to your reporting requirements to the supply chain requirements. The goalposts have shifted, and as Ramo talked about before, like the new methods coming on, they're going to be more strenuous. They're going to be more in depth. They're going to have more requirements in them. It's very important that you understand those changes if you're going into the project, because it's not as easy as it was. It was a lot easier. Now it's going to get harder. You need to understand your position and your relationship with your provider. So if you're using a carbon provider, if you've got an existing one or you're about to sign up to one, you really need to do your research and understand what it is they do and don't provide, and how that sits with your business and what they do and don't provide. Be wary of using your regular family solicitor who doesn't do carbon projects regularly. The really good advice is to go seek out solicitors who do these regularly. There are becoming a bit like wind farms and that. There are specialised solicitors that work in this pack now. And also understand the key drivers of your project, i.e. what produces the credits, right? So if you are a Savannah project, understand it's the cool fires compared to baseline. If you are a soil carbon project, it's intensity of grazing, et cetera, et cetera. Is it trying to kick you out, mate? that might wrap it up anyway, mate. Have we got any credit questions about all that, please? You got yeah, and as Ramo says, yeah, check out who pays for the audits. Bear in mind that carbon project audits can be quite expensive. Minimum $25,000 plus if there's any RFIs and things like that. And yeah, so can people please, if you haven't got any questions, can we just click that participant survey in the link, please, so that federal government knows that we've done our job. It's a short questionnaire about the presentation you just watched. So it would be much appreciated, please, if you can scan the QR code with your phone and go through that process.
And if you can't or not sure how to use the scan button, I've put the link in the chat. So if you go to the chat function, you should be able to just click on the link and it will take you there. And as it says on the slide, when you're completing the survey, the provider is AgForce Queensland Farmers. So if you just type in AGF, the list will come up, and just click on AgForce Queensland Farmers. And then the workshop, if you go in, click on the workshop, and then you start typing ONL, and it will come up. And sorry, it shouldn't be Series 1 supply chains. It should be Series 1 and then carbon farming projects. So it'll be the third one in the list. My mistake for that one. So yeah, if everybody can just have a go at doing those and submit them, that would be wonderful. If there's any other last questions, either raise your hand or chuck them in the chat. Otherwise, thank you very, very much for attending.
Yeah, and the only other thing too, if people want to contact me, if they don't want to ask a question publicly, just get in contact with your local regional manager for AgForce. They can give you my contact details if you want to ask questions directly. happy to answer questions for anyone who's got some.
Is there a correlation between, you know, carbon in soil borne and rainfall?
For soil carbon potential and rainfall, is that what you mean?
Yeah, like if your rainfall, you know, your annual rainfall is quite low, does that affect you? Does that, you know, affect the possibility of carbon in your soil?
Yeah, it does. It does to a degree. So once you slowed in the lower soil carbon, lower rainfall environments, it's hard to keep, to keep that pasture in a growing state. You know, to keep it, you know, to move the cattle through, get a graze off it, and let it recoup, and you know, shear off those sugars in the soil to essentially become your soil carbon. And it might be too that you can mitigate that where you have. So one of the things with soil carbon and rotating cattle is you get a flush of regrowth. So in some areas you might be right on the boundary of the 600 mil, but you actually get a flush of timber and regrowth, right, like small shrubby bushes. So even though you've got less rainfall, you actually might get a whole heap of extra soil carbon from those things as well in the system, right?
Yeah.
So it's a very much a complete view of what's above the ground. You know, the total biomass that is above the ground that can get under the ground, because what is above is below. So it's you know, what you can grow up here and put underneath you is the key. Generally speaking, there's not too many. I think there's only 1 or 2 projects that are registered under the 600 mil mark, and they're sort of in very heavy clay soils in Western Queensland, with the idea that they're really going to ramp up. You know, they're going from a set stock to very large areas, and they're going to ramp right up, and they believe they're going to make it work. So,
Okay.
we'll see. Yeah, it'll be very public if they pull it off. I guarantee.
Yeah.
They'll be singing from the rooftops.
Yeah. Well, hopefully they will, so the rest of us can pick it up.
Yeah. No, that's right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Derek. Well, if there's no more questions, we might wind it up, and thank you all very much for attending. If you missed either Monday's or Tuesday's webinar, if you hop on the AgForce Eventbrite events, you will see that we have another series starting next week, which is pretty much a repeat of this week. But they're between 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. at night time. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
Yeah, thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for your time.
Thank you.